Jeffrey Dahmer, a name that sends chills down the spine, a man whose crimes pushed the boundaries of human depravity and left an indelible mark on criminal history. Born on May 21st, 1960, in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer seemed like an ordinary child to those who knew him. But beneath the surface, a darkness was growing, a darkness that would lead him to commit some of the most horrific acts imaginable. He wasn't the kind of monster you'd expect to see in a horror movie, with a menacing glare or a sinister laugh. No, Dahmer was quiet, unassuming, even charming to those who met him, a man who could blend into any crowd, which made his crimes all the more terrifying. Over a 13-year span, from 1978 to 1991, he lured, murdered, and dismembered 17 young men and boys, his actions driven by a twisted need for control and a macabre fascination with death. He didn't just kill his victims. He kept them with him, in the most gruesome ways imaginable, preserving their bodies as trophies, consuming parts of them, and even attempting to turn them into obedient, lifeless companions through horrifying experiments. His crimes weren't just murders. They involved necrophilia, cannibalism, and attempts to create living zombies, making him one of the most notorious serial killers in history. The sheer scale of his depravity shocked the world, leaving people to wonder how someone could descend into such darkness without anyone noticing.
But what drove him to such unimaginable acts? Was it a product of his troubled childhood, a mental illness, or something far more sinister? Was he born a monster, or did the circumstances of his life shape him into one?
These are the questions that have haunted criminologists, psychologists, and the public for decades, as we try to make sense of a man who seemed to exist on the edge of humanity itself. In this video, we'll dive deep into the life of the man known as the Milwaukee Cannibal, exploring his early years, the gruesome details of his crimes, the investigation that finally stopped him, and the lasting impact of his actions on society. We'll look at the psychological factors that may have contributed to his behavior, the societal failures that allowed him to continue killing for so long, and the cultural fascination that keeps his name alive in the public consciousness. Let's step into the mind of a monster, where the line between humanity and horror blurs, and where the answers to our questions may be more disturbing than we ever imagined. Prepare yourself for a journey into the darkest corners of the human psyche, a journey that will leave you questioning the nature of evil itself. Jeffrey Dahmer's story is not just a tale of horror. It's a stark reminder of the complexities of the human mind, the failures of society to protect the vulnerable, and the enduring quest to understand why someone would commit such atrocities. As we begin, let's set the stage for a story that spans decades, a story that begins in the seemingly idyllic suburbs of Milwaukee, where young boys' troubled childhood would set the stage for a lifetime of darkness. Dahmer's crimes would eventually make headlines around the world, but long before he became a household name, he was a child struggling with feelings of isolation, abandonment, and a growing fascination with death, a fascination that would eventually consume him and lead to the deaths of 17 innocent lives. This is a story of tragedy, horror, and the search for answers, a story that forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil, the failures of our systems, and the human capacity for both darkness and resilience. Let's take a closer look at the man behind the monster, starting with the early years that shaped him into the Milwaukee Cannibal, a name that would become synonymous with terror.
Join the adventure. Subscribe now and unlock a world of exciting histories.
Let's start at the beginning, Dahmer's early life, which seemed unremarkable on the surface, but the seeds of his darkness were sown long before his first crime, rooted in a childhood that was far from idyllic. Growing up in Milwaukee, Jeffrey Lionel Dahmer was the eldest son of Lionel and Joyce Dahmer, a couple who, to the outside world, American family living in a quiet suburban neighborhood in the 1960s. But behind closed doors, their home was a place of tension, emotional distance, and unspoken struggles that would leave a lasting impact on young Jeffrey, shaping him in ways that no one could have predicted. His father, Lionel, was a chemist, a man dedicated to his career, often working long hours at his laboratory, leaving Jeffrey without a strong male role model to guide him through his formative years. Lionel was a man of science, methodical, reserved, and emotionally distant, and while he loved his son, he struggled to connect with him on a deeper level, often prioritizing his work over family time, a dynamic that left Jeffrey feeling neglected and unseen. His mother, Joyce, struggled with severe mental health issues, battling anxiety and depression that often left her bedridden or emotionally unavailable, creating a void in Jeffrey's life where maternal warmth and support should have been. She was prescribed a cocktail of medications during her pregnancy with Jeffrey, including sedatives and anti-anxiety drugs, raising questions among psychologists about whether prenatal exposure to these substances may have affected his neurological development, a theory that remains speculative but has been debated in the years since his crimes came to light. As a young child, Jeffrey was quiet, shy, and introverted, often retreating into his own world, a world that soon became disturbingly macabre as his interests took a dark turn. He had few friends, preferring solitude over social interaction, and his introverted nature made him a target for teasing at school, where classmates saw him as odd, awkward, and different, further isolating him from his peers. By the age of 10, Dahmer developed a fascination with dead animals, collecting roadkill, dissecting them, and even dissolving their bones in acid, a chilling precursor to his later crimes that went unnoticed by those around him. He would spend hours in the woods, searching for carcasses, a solitary activity that allowed him to indulge in his growing obsession with death, an obsession that was both a coping mechanism for his loneliness and a sign of something far more sinister brewing beneath the surface. One incident stands out. He once brought home a dead squirrel, proudly showing it to his father, who dismissed it as a childish curiosity, failing to recognize the deeper implications of his son's behavior, a missed opportunity to intervene before his fascination escalated into something deadly. Dahmer later admitted,
"I was always curious about what it would be like to kill something."
a statement that revealed the early stirrings of his violent impulses that would grow stronger with each passing year, unchecked by any meaningful intervention from his family or community. His parents' relationship deteriorated over the years, with frequent arguments and emotional distance, creating a tense home environment, a dynamic that only deepened Jeffrey's sense of isolation and abandonment. Their divorce in 1978, when Jeffrey was 18, marked a turning point in his life, pushing him further into a spiral of loneliness and despair, as he felt abandoned by both parents at a critical moment in his development. The divorce was messy, with Lionel and Joyce fighting bitterly over custody of Jeffrey's younger brother, David, while Jeffrey himself was largely ignored, left to fend for himself in the family home in Bath Township, Ohio, a situation that exacerbated his feelings of worthlessness and rejection. High school classmates noticed his increasingly odd behavior. He drank heavily, often showing up to class intoxicated, earning him the nickname, the class drunk, a moniker that reflected his growing dependence on alcohol as a means of coping with his inner turmoil. He performed bizarre stunts to get attention, like faking seizures or shouting random phrases in the hallways, desperate for any kind of recognition, even if it was negative, a sign of his deep-seated need for connection and validation. But beneath the surface, a darker obsession was growing, one that would soon spiral out of control as he began to fantasize about death, control, and domination, imagining scenarios where he could exert complete power over another human being. These fantasies became more vivid as he approached adulthood, fueled by his isolation, his drinking, and his inability to form meaningful relationships, a toxic combination that set the stage for his first act of violence. Dahmer's first murder came just weeks after his high school graduation in June 1978, marking the beginning of a 13-year reign of terror that would shock the world and leave a trail of devastation in its wake. With his family away, Dahmer saw an opportunity to act on his long-buried desires, inviting a young man named Stephen Hicks to his family home in Bath Township under the pretense of drinking together, a ruse that would become a hallmark of his later crimes. Hicks, a 19-year-old, had just graduated high school and was looking for a night of fun, unaware that he was walking into a trap set by a predator who had been planning this moment for years, a predator whose fantasies were about to become a horrifying reality. Once Hicks was intoxicated, Dahmer killed him by striking him with a dumbbell, a brutal act that he later described as both terrifying and exhilarating, the culmination of years of dark fantasies that had finally found an outlet in violence. He then dismembered the body with a kitchen knife, a process that took hours and required a level of detachment that was chilling in its methodical nature, as he carefully separated the flesh from the bones, treating the act as a kind of grotesque ritual. He dissolved the remains in acid, a technique he had learned from his experiments with animals, and crushed the bones with a sledgehammer, disposing of them in the trash, a process that took days and left him both exhausted and exhilarated, a sign of the deep satisfaction he derived from the act. He described the act.
It felt like I finally had control over someone.
Revealing his deep-seated need for domination, a need that would drive him to kill again and again, as the temporary satisfaction of his first kill only fueled his desire for more. His early isolation played a significant role in shaping his psyche, as he never learned how to form healthy relationships, instead turning inward to a world of dark fantasies that would eventually consume him, a world where death and control became his only means of connection. The lack of emotional support from his parents left him feeling unloved and unwanted, a void he would later try to fill with the bodies of his victims, a tragic and horrifying consequence of a childhood marked by neglect, loneliness, and a failure to address his growing psychological issues. Looking back, it's clear that the warning signs were there: his fascination with death, his isolation, his drinking, his bizarre behavior, but no one intervened, allowing his darkness to grow unchecked, a failure that would have devastating consequences for so many lives. The tragedy of Dahmer's early life lies not just in the horrors he would later commit, but in the missed opportunities to help a troubled child before he became a monster, a child who might have been saved with the right support, guidance, and intervention. As we move forward, let's explore how these early experiences set the stage for an escalation of violence that would span over a decade, a period during which Dahmer's crimes would become increasingly depraved, leaving a trail of victims in his wake and exposing the failures of those who might have stopped him sooner. After his first kill, Dahmer's urges didn't disappear. They only grew stronger, setting the stage for a horrifying escalation that would span over a decade, a period during which his crimes would become increasingly frequent and depraved. For the next 9 years, Dahmer's killings were sporadic, as he struggled with his urges while trying to maintain a facade of normalcy, a balancing act that became increasingly difficult as his dark impulses grew more powerful. He enrolled at Ohio State University in 1978, hoping to start fresh and perhaps escape the darkness that had begun to consume him, but he dropped out after just one semester, overwhelmed by his drinking and inability to focus on his studies, a failure that only deepened his sense of worthlessness. His father, desperate to help, pushed him to find some direction in life, hoping that a structured environment might provide the stability Jeffrey so desperately needed. But these efforts were in vain, as Jeffrey's inner turmoil was already too deep to be resolved by a change of scenery or academic pursuits. He joined the U.S. Army in 1979, at his father's urging, hoping the structure of military life would help him get his life together. But he was discharged 2 years later in 1981 for alcoholism, a problem that had plagued him since his teenage years and would continue to haunt him for the rest of his life. During his time in the Army, stationed in Baumholder, West Germany, his behavior raised red flags. He was disciplined multiple times for drunken behavior, and there were rumors of suspicious incidents involving other soldiers, though no concrete evidence of crimes emerged during this period. Some of his fellow soldiers later recalled,
"He was always strange, always drinking, and he kept to himself."
A description that painted a picture of a man already on the edge, even in a highly structured environment where discipline and camaraderie were supposed to provide a sense of purpose. After his discharge, he returned to the United States, briefly living in Miami, Florida, where he worked at a sandwich shop, a short-lived attempt at normalcy that quickly fell apart as his drinking and isolation continued to dominate his life. In 1982, he moved back to Ohio, but his behavior became increasingly erratic, leading to his arrest for disorderly conduct, a sign that his ability to maintain a facade of normalcy was crumbling under the weight of his inner demons. He then moved into his grandmother's house in West Allis, a suburb of Milwaukee, hoping for a fresh start under her watchful eye. But this move only provided him with a new space to continue his crimes, as his grandmother's home became a new stage for his horrors. His grandmother's basement became a secret sanctuary for his gruesome acts, a place where he could hide the bodies of his victims without arousing suspicion, at least for a while, as he continued to refine his methods of killing and disposal. Between 1982 and 1988, Dahmer killed several more victims at his grandmother's house, luring them with promises of money or companionship, a pattern that was becoming disturbingly routine for him, as he honed his ability to manipulate and deceive those around him. He would often dismember the bodies in the basement, using acid to dissolve the remains, a process he had perfected since his first kill, and disposing of the bones in the trash or in nearby wooded areas, a methodical approach that allowed him to evade detection for years. His grandmother began to notice strange smells and noises coming from the basement, describing them as a mix of chemicals and decay, but she attributed them to Jeffrey's experiments with chemicals, a naive assumption that allowed him to continue his killing spree unchecked. She later recalled,
"I thought he was just doing some kind of science project down there."
A heartbreaking reflection on how close she came to uncovering the truth, yet how far she was from understanding the horror unfolding in her own home, a horror that would claim the lives of several young men before she finally took action. By 1988, his grandmother could no longer tolerate his behavior, the smells, the late-night visitors, the constant drinking, and she asked him to move out, a decision that would inadvertently lead to an even more intense period of killing, as Dahmer was now free to operate without any oversight. Dahmer then moved to apartment 213, a small unit in Milwaukee's Oxford Apartments, a low-income housing complex that would become the primary stage for his killing spree, a place where he would commit the majority of his murders over the next 3 years. This apartment became a house of horrors, a place where he lured victims with promises of money or companionship, only to subject them to unspeakable acts, a space that would later be described by investigators as a living nightmare. He would often meet his victims at gay bars, bus stops, or malls, targeting those who were vulnerable, runaways, drifters, or men struggling with poverty, knowing they were less likely to be missed, a calculated strategy that allowed him to continue his crimes with little fear of immediate consequences. His methods became more refined as he learned how to manipulate his victims, offering them drinks laced with sedatives to render them helpless, a tactic that allowed him to maintain complete control over their fate, a control that he craved above all else. By 1991, his killings had escalated to a terrifying frequency, with Dahmer murdering as often as once a week, his methods growing increasingly depraved as he experimented with necrophilia, cannibalism, and attempts to create living zombies by injecting acid or boiling water into his victims' brains, a desperate attempt to create companions who would never leave him, a reflection of his deep-seated fear of abandonment. He later explained,
I wanted them to stay with me, to be mine forever.
a chilling insight into his psyche, revealing a deep-seated fear of abandonment that drove his horrific actions, a fear that had its roots in his troubled childhood and the emotional neglect he experienced. His drinking intensified, becoming a crutch to numb the guilt and fear that occasionally surfaced, though it also made him more reckless, increasing the likelihood of his capture, as his ability to cover his tracks began to falter under the influence of alcohol. He kept detailed records, taking Polaroid photos of his victims at various stages of dismemberment, a macabre scrapbook that he would later use to relive the experiences, a practice that showed the depth of his obsession with his crimes and his need to maintain a connection with his victims even after their deaths. His isolation grew as he cut off contact with his family and friends, retreating further into his own world, a world where his victims were the only company he desired, a world where he could indulge in his darkest fantasies without fear of judgment or interference.
What was going through his mind during this time? How could someone live a double life, balancing the facade of normalcy with such horrific acts, without anyone noticing the signs of his descent into madness?
The answers lie in the psychological torment that drove Dahmer to these extremes, a torment that was fueled by a combination of mental illness, childhood trauma, and a society that failed to recognize the warning signs. His neighbors began to notice the strange smells emanating from his apartment, describing them as a mix of rotting meat and chemicals, a stench that permeated the entire building, but their complaints were ignored by the building management, a failure that allowed Dahmer to continue his killing spree unchecked. The community around him remained oblivious to the horrors taking place in their midst, a stark reminder of how easily evil can hide in plain sight, especially when society fails to pay attention to the most vulnerable among us, a failure that would have tragic consequences for Dahmer's victims and their families. As his killings escalated, Dahmer became more brazen, taking greater risks that would eventually lead to his downfall, a downfall that was precipitated by a series of events that would finally bring his reign of terror to an end, events that we'll explore in the next section of this video. Apartment 213 at Oxford Apartments became the epicenter of Dahmer's depravity, a place where his darkest fantasies came to life, transforming a small, unassuming apartment into a chamber of horrors that would later be described by investigators as a scene straight out of a nightmare. Between 1988 and 1991, he lured at least 12 victims to this apartment, targeting vulnerable young men, many of whom were from marginalized communities, including African American, Asian, and Latino men, often those who were struggling financially or socially, making them easy prey for a predator like Dahmer. His method was calculated. He would offer money for photos or companionship, ply them with alcohol laced with sedatives, and then kill them, often by strangulation, ensuring they were completely under his control, a control that he craved above all else. He would sometimes keep his victims alive for hours, drugged and helpless, as he carried out his twisted rituals, a process that gave him a sense of power and domination that he had been seeking since childhood, a power that he found intoxicating and addictive. Dahmer's actions after the murders were even more horrifying. He engaged in necrophilia, dismembered the bodies with meticulous precision, and kept trophies like skulls and body parts, some of which he stored in his refrigerator or preserved in jars, as a way to relive the experience and maintain a connection with his victims even after their deaths. He would often boil the skulls to remove the flesh, painting them to use as decorations, a macabre display of his obsession with death that turned his apartment into a grotesque shrine to his crimes. Later confessed,
I wanted to keep them with me forever.
a chilling insight into his obsession with possession and his inability to form genuine human connections, a void he tried to fill with the bodies of his victims, a void that had its roots in the emotional neglect he experienced as a child. His attempts to create zombies involved drilling holes into his victims' skulls while they were still alive, injecting acid or boiling water in a grotesque attempt to render them into a submissive, lifeless state. A horrifying experiment that always ended in death, as the victims succumbed to the trauma, a testament to the depths of Dahmer's depravity and his desperation to create companions who would never leave him. Neighbors often complained about the foul smells and strange noises coming from his apartment, describing a stench like rotting meat that permeated the entire building, but their concerns were repeatedly ignored by the building management, who dismissed them as issues with spoiled food or plumbing problems, a failure that allowed Dahmer to continue his killing spree unchecked. One victim, 14-year-old Konorak Sinthasumphone, nearly escaped in May 1991, stumbling naked and disoriented into the street after Dahmer had drugged him and attempted his zombie experiment, a moment that could have ended Dahmer's reign of terror if not for a tragic series of events. Two women who found him called the police, concerned for the boy's safety, but Dahmer convinced the officers that Konorak was his 19-year-old boyfriend and that they had simply had a drunken argument, a lie that the police accepted without further investigation, despite Konorak's obvious distress and the women's protests. The police returned Konorak to Dahmer, a decision that would later be seen as one of the most tragic failures in the case, as Konorak was murdered just hours later, his body dismembered and disposed of like so many others, a preventable tragedy that would haunt the Milwaukee Police Department for years and spark outrage among the community. By July 1991, Dahmer's actions were spiraling out of control, his apartment overflowing with evidence of his crimes, barrels of acid, preserved body parts, and photographs of his victims in various stages of dismemberment, all of which would soon lead to his downfall, as the sheer volume of evidence made it impossible for him to continue without being caught. The apartment was a nightmare, a space so filled with the remnants of his crimes that it was only a matter of time before he was discovered, a space that would later be described by investigators as one of the most horrific crime scenes they had ever encountered. His neighbors grew increasingly suspicious, some even reporting hearing screams or seeing strange men entering his apartment but never leaving. Yet no one took action until it was too late, a failure of community vigilance that allowed Dahmer to continue his killing spree unchecked. The smell became unbearable, permeating the entire building, a constant reminder of the horrors taking place just steps away from unsuspecting residents, a stench that was so overpowering that it's a wonder no one acted sooner to investigate its source.
How could such horrors go unnoticed for so long?
The answer lies in a combination of societal neglect, systemic failures, and Dahmer's ability to manipulate those around him, a deadly combination that allowed his reign of terror to continue unchecked, a combination that we'll explore further as we move into the investigation that finally brought him to justice. The tragedy of Konorak Sinthasumphone and the other victims who suffered in apartment 213 is a stark reminder of the consequences of inaction, a reminder that we must be vigilant in protecting the most vulnerable among us, a lesson that came at a devastating cost for the families of Dahmer's victims. On July 22, 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer's reign of terror finally came to an end, thanks to the bravery of one of his intended victims, Tracy Edwards, whose escape would lead to one of the most shocking arrests in criminal history. Edwards, a 32-year-old man, had been lured to Dahmer's apartment under the pretense of drinking together, a tactic Dahmer had used countless times before. But this time, his victim would not go quietly into the night. Once inside the apartment, Edwards quickly realized something was terribly wrong. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and Dahmer's demeanor shifted from friendly to menacing as he brandished a knife and handcuffs, attempting to restrain Edwards and make him his next victim. Edwards managed to escape, fighting off Dahmer's attempts to subdue him and fleeing the apartment in a desperate bid for freedom, running into the street where he flagged down two Milwaukee police officers, Robert Roth and Ralph Mueller, who were patrolling the area. He told the officers about the horrors he had witnessed, describing a knife, handcuffs, and a terrifying atmosphere that left him fearing for his life, a story that immediately raised red flags for the officers, who decided to investigate further. The officers accompanied Edwards back to apartment 213, where they were met with a scene that would haunt them for the rest of their lives, a scene that confirmed Edwards' story and revealed the true extent of Dahmer's depravity. Upon entering the apartment, the officers were overwhelmed by the smell of decay, a stench so powerful that it was almost unbearable, and as they began to search the space, they quickly discovered evidence of Dahmer's crimes, Polaroid photos of dismembered bodies, a human head in the refrigerator, and barrels of acid containing human remains, all of which painted a horrifying picture of what had been happening behind closed doors. Dahmer initially tried to explain,
"It's just some stuff I'm working on."
but his excuses fell apart as the officers continued their search, uncovering more and more evidence that left no doubt about the nature of his crimes, evidence that would soon make headlines around the world. He was arrested on the spot, handcuffed and taken into custody as the officers called for backup, knowing they had stumbled upon something far beyond routine call, a discovery that would send shockwaves through Milwaukee and beyond. The investigation that followed was one of the most extensive in Milwaukee's history, with forensic teams spending days cataloging the evidence in apartment 213, a process that revealed the full scope of Dahmer's atrocities, 17 victims, countless body parts, and a level of depravity that defied comprehension. Dahmer confessed almost immediately, providing chilling details about his crimes, admitting to the murders, the necrophilia, the cannibalism, and his attempts to create zombies, a confession that was both a relief to investigators, who now had a clear picture of the case, and a source of horror, as the true extent of his actions came to light. He described his methods.
"I would lure them with promises of money or drinks, then drug them and kill them."
A statement that revealed the calculated nature of his crimes, a nature that made his ability to evade capture for so long all the more chilling. The media frenzy that followed was unprecedented, with news outlets around the world covering the story, dubbing Dahmer the Milwaukee Cannibal and sensationalizing every detail of his crimes, a coverage that brought both attention to the case and pain to the victims' families, who were forced to relive their loss in the public eye. The Milwaukee Police Department faced intense scrutiny, particularly for their failure to save Conorak's Synthesumphone, a failure that led to protests and calls for reform, as the community demanded answers about how such a tragedy could have been prevented, a demand that highlighted the systemic issues that had allowed Dahmer to continue killing for so long. Dahmer's arrest marked the end of his killing spree, but it was only the beginning of a long and painful process for the families of his victims, who now had to face the reality of their loved ones' fates, a reality that was as heartbreaking as it was horrifying. The investigation also revealed the societal failures that had enabled Dahmer's crimes, from the ignored complaints of neighbors to the police's mishandling of Conorak's case, failures that would lead to changes in how law enforcement handled missing persons cases and reports of suspicious activity. Changes that came too late for Dahmer's victims, but would hopefully prevent future tragedies. As the case unfolded, the world watched in horror, grappling with the question of how someone could commit such acts, a question that would dominate the trial that followed, a trial that would seek to determine not just Dahmer's guilt, but the nature of his sanity, a question that remains debated to this day. Dahmer's trial began on January 30th, 1992, in Milwaukee, a highly publicized event that drew international attention as the world sought to understand the mind of a man who had committed such unimaginable acts and to determine whether he was legally sane at the time of his crimes. The prosecution argued that Dahmer was fully aware of his actions, pointing to the calculated nature of his killings, his ability to evade capture for so long, and his methodical disposal of evidence as proof that he knew right from wrong, a key factor in determining legal sanity. The defense, however, claimed that Dahmer was insane, driven by uncontrollable urges stemming from severe mental illness, including necrophilia, borderline personality disorder, and a host of other psychological issues, arguing that his actions were the result of a mind so broken that he could not be held fully responsible. Psychologists testified on both sides, offering conflicting opinions about Dahmer's mental state, with some describing him as a psychopath who knew exactly what he was doing, while others argued that his compulsions were so overpowering that he was unable to stop himself, a debate that highlighted the complexity of his psyche and the difficulty of defining insanity in such a case. Dahmer himself spoke during the trial, delivering a chilling statement that offered little comfort to the victims' families, saying,
"I never wanted this to happen, but I couldn't stop myself."
A statement that revealed a mix of remorse and detachment, leaving many to wonder whether he truly understood the gravity of his actions or was simply trying to manipulate the court. After a 2-week trial, the jury rejected Dahmer's insanity plea, finding him guilty on all counts, 15 charges of murder, as 2 of the killings could not be proven beyond a reasonable doubt due to lack of physical evidence, a verdict that was met with a mix of relief and sorrow by those in the courtroom. He was sentenced to 15 consecutive life sentences, a total of 957 years in prison, ensuring that he would never walk free again, a punishment that many felt was the only justice possible for a man who had caused so much pain, though some argued that even this was not enough to atone for his crimes. Dahmer was sent to Columbia Correctional Institution in Portage, Wisconsin, where he was initially kept in solitary confinement for his own safety, as his crimes had made him a target among other inmates, many of whom saw him as the ultimate symbol of evil. On November 28, 1994, Dahmer's life came to a violent end when he was brutally murdered by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver, who beat him to death with a metal bar during a work detail, claiming he was acting on behalf of the victims' families, an act that brought a sudden and bloody conclusion to Dahmer's story at the age of 34. His death marked the end of a dark chapter in criminal history, but for the families of his victims, the pain of their loss would never fully heal, a wound that was reopened every time Dahmer's name appeared in the media, a reminder of the loved ones they had lost to his brutality. Dahmer's legacy continues to haunt the true crime community, serving as a cautionary tale about the depths of human darkness, the importance of addressing mental health issues before they spiral into tragedy, and the need for society to protect its most vulnerable members, lessons that remain relevant decades after his crimes. Today, Dahmer's name is synonymous with evil, a symbol of the worst aspects of humanity, a reminder of the lives he took and the families he destroyed, but also a call to action to ensure that such a monster can never again hide in plain sight, a call that has led to changes in law enforcement and mental health awareness. The impact on Milwaukee lingers, with the city still working to heal from the trauma of Dahmer's crimes, a trauma that exposed deep-seated issues of racism, homophobia, and systemic neglect, particularly in the way the police handled the cases of his victims, many of whom were from marginalized communities. The fascination with Dahmer shows no signs of fading, as new generations discover his story through documentaries, books, and dramatizations, raising questions about why we are so drawn to the darkest corners of human history, a fascination that has sparked both interest and controversy. Some argue that this fascination is a way to understand the nature of evil, to learn from the past, and prevent future tragedies, while others believe it risks glorifying Dahmer and overshadowing the victims, turning a tragedy into entertainment at the expense of those who suffered the most. The ethical debate rages on, with critics pointing out that the commercialization of Dahmer's story often exploits the pain of the victims' families, who have repeatedly spoken out against the constant retelling of their loved ones' deaths, a pain that is compounded by the media's focus on Dahmer rather than the lives he took. Dahmer's story also inspired changes in law enforcement, particularly in how police handle reports of suspicious activity and missing persons, with the Conarac synthesomphone incident serving as a tragic example of what can happen when warning signs are ignored, leading to reforms that aim to prevent such failures in the future. Ultimately, Dahmer's legacy is a complex one, a mix of horror, tragedy, and a call for change, reminding us that while monsters may walk among us, it's our responsibility to recognize the signs and take action before it's too late, a responsibility that falls on all of us to ensure that history does not repeat itself. As we close this chapter, let's take a moment to remember the 17 young men and boys whose lives were taken. Stephen Hicks, Stephen Twomey, James Dockstader, Richard Guerrero, Anthony Sears, Raymond Smith, Edward Smith, Ernest Miller, David Thomas, Curtis Strader, Errol Lindsay, Tony Hughes, Conarac synthesomphone, Matt Turner, Jeremiah Weinberger, Oliver Lacey, and Joseph Braidhoft. Their names deserve to be remembered, their stories deserve to be told, and their memories deserve to be honored, not overshadowed by the man who took them from this world, a man whose actions will forever serve as a reminder of the darkness that can lurk within the human soul.
What do you think about Jeffrey Dahmer's case? Do you believe he was a product of his environment, or was he destined to become a monster? What lessons can we learn from this tragedy to prevent future horrors?
Share your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this video insightful, don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit that notification bell for more deep dives into the cases that have shaped our understanding of crime and humanity. Until next time, stay curious, stay safe, and let's keep the conversation going as we continue to explore the complexities of the human mind and the societal systems that shape our world.